I got my eyes on you, mountain man. One wrong move, and you're mine.
Don't touch them. A hand slammed onto the table, hard enough to rattle the bell and choke the chant mid-word. The auctioneer froze. Bidders turned. The sheriff straightened. The two girls did not move. The mountain man stood at the rail, coat dusty, eyes flat, voice finished before it started. Someone laughed. Someone said he was late. The auctioneer cleared his throat and said property was already listed, terms posted, county approved. The man said nothing. The sheriff leaned close and asked if he was lost. The man looked past him and said, "Don't touch them again." The auctioneer tried to recover. He said the girls came as a pair, no papers missing, county ward sale, final and clean. A bidder asked about age. Another asked about labor. A woman asked if they were sisters. The auctioneer answered fast and wrong, calling them units, calling them suitable, calling them manageable. The older girl clenched her jaw. The younger stared at the man like she had been waiting all day. The sheriff warned the room to behave. The man asked the price. A number was called. A hand rose. Another followed. The chant resumed, louder now. The girls were talked over. The older one said stop. No one heard. The younger one whispered nothing. The mountain man raised his hand once. The auctioneer blinked and said the number again louder. A bidder scoffed. The man raised his hand higher. The sheriff said he could not be serious. The man said make it final. The bidding jumped hard. The crowd murmured, annoyed, curious. Someone said that was foolish. Someone said that was land money. The mountain man did not look at them. He watched the girls. He nodded once when the price doubled. The auctioneer hesitated and the man said now. The gavel fell too hard. The chant died. The room felt smaller. The sheriff exhaled through his teeth and said, "You just bought trouble." The man said, "I paid." Papers slid across the table. Ink bled through thin pages. The auctioneer asked for a name. The man gave it low. The sheriff heard it and stiffened. He leaned in and said, "You know what people say about that ridge." The man signed anyway. The sheriff said, "You don't keep girls safe by hiding them." The man said, "I don't hide." The sheriff said, "You won't last." The man said, "Neither do you." The older girl stepped closer, eyes sharp, counting exits without turning her head. She asked where they were going. The man said up. She asked for how long. He said, "We'll see." She said she needed shoes. He said, "We'll stop." The sheriff watched them like inventory walking off. He said, "This isn't mercy." The man said, "It isn't business either." The auctioneer rang the bell out of habit, too late to matter. Chairs scraped. Voices dropped into whispers that cut sharper than shouting. A bidder spat on the floor and said, "Fools don't live long." Another said, "The mountain eats men like him." The sheriff said nothing now. He just watched the man's hands, steady, scarred, unmoving as he folded the papers and tucked them into his coat. The younger girl moved last. She crossed the floor without fear and touched the man's coat like proof. He flinched before he could stop himself. She looked up and smiled once, small and sure, like she had already decided something no one could take back. She leaned in, close enough that only he could hear, and whispered, "Papa." No one laughed. No one corrected her. The word sat in the air like smoke that would not thin. The mountain man did not move. His jaw locked. The auctioneer stared at the floor. The sheriff was the first to breathe. He leaned forward and said slow, "You know him?" The younger girl nodded once, already sure. The man opened his mouth and stopped. The older girl stepped between them and said she knows what she sees. The sheriff looked at the man, then at the papers, then back at the child. He said that isn't how names work. The younger girl said it is for me. The man crouched to her level, careful, stiff. He said you don't call me that. She tilted her head. She said why? He said because it's not true. She said it feels true. The older girl watched his face, weighing damage. She said we're not staying long, right? He nodded too fast. He said temporary. The younger girl frowned. She said everything is temporary. He had no answer for that. The sheriff straightened and cleared his throat. He said county needs clarity. The man stood and said papers are signed. The sheriff said that word changes things. The man said words don't change law. The sheriff said they change people. The man said not me. The sheriff looked at the girls again. He said you girls understand this is a placement. The older one said we understand enough. The younger one said Papa drives a truck. The sheriff flinched at that, just slightly. The crowd began to peel away, slow and loud. Someone said she's confused. Someone said she's dangerous. Someone said the mountain man finally snapped. Boots scraped. Chairs folded. Eyes lingered with resentment, with hunger, with a kind of joy at future failure. The auctioneer packed his ledger like it might bite him. The sheriff stepped closer to the man and lowered his voice. He said the mountain keeps receipts. The man said so do I. The sheriff said you don't get to rewrite blood. The man said neither do you. They walked toward the exit. The girls between them, one light, one tense. Outside, engines coughed. The younger girl skipped once and grabbed his hand. He froze, then let it happen. The older girl said she doesn't do that with anyone. He said she shouldn't. The younger girl said I already did. He said don't again. She smiled and did it anyway. At the truck, the man opened the door and paused. The papers were folded too tight in his fist. His knuckles burned. The sheriff stopped a few steps back and said you hear me. The man did not turn. The sheriff said you take them up there and the past will follow. The man said it already does. The sheriff said you can still back out. The man said no. The sheriff said then don't say I didn't warn you. The younger girl climbed into the cab without help, like she had been there before. The older girl hesitated. She looked at the man and said if you hurt her I will burn everything you love. He met her eyes. He said fair? She nodded and climbed in. The man stood with the door open, listening to a voice that was not there. Low, rough, tired. A man telling him names are earned. A man telling him mountains take sons first. His chest tightened. The younger girl leaned across the seat and said Papa. Not loud. Not testing. Just saying it again, like a fact that refused to leave. He shut the door too hard. The truck started. Gravel popped under the tires. He drove forward, not looking back, gripping the papers until the ink bled through his skin. The truck rolled as soon as the door shut, engine pulling them forward before anyone could decide otherwise. Gravel snapped under the tires. The younger girl leaned against the window and traced the dust with her finger like she owned it. The older one sat straight, eyes forward, watching the mirrors. The man drove without speaking. After a mile, the younger girl said, "Is this yours?" He said yes. She said, "It smells like iron." He said, "Don't touch the dash." She touched it anyway. The older girl asked how far. He said, "Far enough." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "It is for now." She nodded once, storing it. The younger girl opened the glove box. He said, "Don't." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I said so." She closed it slow, testing the rule like a bruise. Outside, the road narrowed. Trees leaned closer. Old markers passed, crooked and faded. The man slowed without thinking. The younger girl pointed. She said, "What's that hole?" He glanced and said, "An old well." She said, "Is it empty?" He said, "Yes." She watched it disappear behind them and said, "Wells don't empty." The older girl looked at him then, sharp. She said, "People say that." He said, "People say a lot." She said, "People who live here say that." He didn't answer. The truck climbed. Burned fence posts lined the road like teeth. The younger girl kicked her heels against the seat and said, "Who lived with you?" He said, "No one." She said, "Before." He said, "Still no one." The older girl said, "You live alone." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it's quiet." She said, "That's not the reason." He tightened his grip on the wheel. He said, "Rules." She said, "What rules?" He said, "You listen when I say stop." She said, "And if we don't?" He said, "Then you learn." She said, "Learn what?" He said, "Consequences." The younger girl laughed once, soft. She said, "I already know those." He glanced at her. She was smiling at nothing. The road bent hard. A rusted sign warned of weight limits that no longer mattered. He slowed again. The older girl said, "You're careful." He said, "The road remembers." She said, "Remembers what?" He said, "Mistakes." They rode in silence for a stretch. Wind pushed through cracked glass. The younger girl rested her head against his arm like it was decided long ago. He stiffened and then let it stay. The older girl said, "You don't smell like bad men." He said, "Don't decide that yet." She said, "I already did." He said, "You shouldn't trust easy." She said, "We don't. We watch." He nodded once. Another well passed, half caved in, ringed with stones. The younger girl whispered, "Mama." The man flinched. He said, "What?" She said, "Nothing." The older girl said, "She remembers things wrong sometimes." He said, "That happens." She said, "Not like this." The younger girl tapped the window and said, "She's down there." He said, "Who?" She said, "A lady who sings at night." The older girl snapped, "Her mind makes stories." The man said, "Let her talk." The older girl went still at that. The road climbed higher. Trees thinned. The cabin came into view, low and dark, tucked against rock like it was hiding on purpose. The man eased the truck to a stop. The younger girl leaned forward and said, "We're home." He said, "No." She said, "Yes." The older girl studied the place, eyes narrowing, then relaxed like something had clicked. She said, "You've been waiting." He shut off the engine. Silence pressed in, heavy and familiar. He looked at the cabin and felt it look back. Neither girl looked surprised. The door opened with a sound that felt held back, like it had been waiting. The man stepped inside first, scanning out of habit. The cabin smelled clean, old, untouched by time but not abandoned. Furniture sat where it always had. Nothing soft. Nothing wasted. The younger girl slipped past him and kicked off her shoes without asking. The older girl followed slower, eyes moving, counting corners, memorizing shadows. The man said, "Don't wander." The younger girl said, "I'm not." She walked straight to the table and ran her fingers along the grooves like she knew them. The older girl asked who lived here before. He said, "No one you need to know." She opened a cabinet anyway. Plates stacked neat. Cups facing the same way. She said, "You keep it like someone's coming back." He said, "Habit." She said, "Whose?" He didn't answer. The younger girl moved toward the shelf and pulled down a book. A Bible. She flipped it open and papers slid out. Letters. Old. Folded thin. Handwriting careful, crowded. The older girl took them from her and read the names. All women. She looked at him and said, "These aren't yours." He said, "Put them back." She said, "No." He took a breath. He said, "They stay here." She said, "So did they." The younger girl sat on the floor and leaned against the wall like it fit her shape. She hummed under her breath, low and wrong. The man said, "Stop that." She said, "Mama liked the song." The older girl snapped, "Where is she?" He said, "That's enough." The older girl said, "You said let her talk." He looked away. The cabin felt smaller now, like it had leaned in. The older girl held up one letter. She said, "This one says taken." He swallowed. She said, "Taken how?" He said, "By men who wore clean hands and dirty smiles." She said, "And your mother?" He said, "She didn't leave. She was taken." The words landed hard, plain, final. The younger girl looked up. She said, "Where is she buried?" He didn't answer. Silence filled the room, thick as smoke. The older girl said, "That means she isn't." He said, "Put the letters back." She said, "Not yet." The younger girl stood and walked to him. She pressed her ear to his chest like she was listening for something. She said, "It's loud in here." He said, "Get back." She didn't. The older girl said, "She hears things." He said, "She shouldn't." The older girl said, "Neither should you." He flinched at that. A knock hit the door. Hard. Close. The man froze. The older girl turned toward the sound, jaw set. The younger girl smiled. She said, "He came fast." The man said, "Stay behind me." He moved to the door and opened it without asking who it was. The sheriff stood there, hat in hand, eyes already inside. He said, "Afternoon." The man said, "You weren't invited." The sheriff smiled thin. He said, "I don't need one." The sheriff stepped inside like the door belonged to him, boots crossing the threshold before permission could exist. He looked around slow, taking inventory, nodding at the walls like they had been witnesses once. He said, "You keep it tidy." The man said, "Get to it." The sheriff smiled, soft and practiced. He said, "County worries when paperwork moves fast." The older girl said, "It moved fair." The sheriff glanced at her, surprised she spoke. He said, "I was talking to him." She said, "We noticed." The sheriff set his hat on the table without asking. He said, "Folks were confused back there." The man said, "They always are." The sheriff said, "You outbid families." The man said, "I outbid greed." The sheriff chuckled. He said, "Same thing sometimes." He looked at the younger girl, crouched by the wall, calm as a stone. He said, "You girls settling in?" The younger girl said, "Papa has a quiet house." The word hit harder indoors. The sheriff's smile slipped. He said, "That's not his name." The older girl said, "Names aren't owned." The sheriff turned to the man. He said, "You know how this looks." The man said, "I don't care." The sheriff said, "You should." He walked to the window and looked out toward the trees. He said, "This land doesn't like surprises." The older girl said, "It's already had plenty." The sheriff faced her now. He said, "Careful." She said, "No. You be careful." He studied her, seeing something he did not like. He said, "You got fire in you." She said, "So did the women you buried." The air shifted. The man said, "That's enough." The sheriff raised a hand. He said, "Easy." He said to the man, "You live alone up here?" The man said, "Not anymore." The sheriff said, "Men like you don't raise girls out here." The younger girl stood and walked over. She put her hand flat on the man's chest, right where old scars pulled the skin wrong. She said Papa stays. The sheriff stared at her hand like it offended him. The man felt something break loose inside, clean and sharp. He said, "You don't get to tell me what I am." The sheriff said, "I get to tell you how this ends." The man said, "You don't end things. You hide them." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He said, "Watch your mouth." The man said, "Watch yours. You wear a badge like it makes you God. It doesn't. It makes you loud." Silence pressed in. The older girl watched the sheriff like she was memorizing him for later. The younger girl did not move her hand. The sheriff finally picked up his hat. He said, "I came to help." The man said, "You came to warn." The sheriff said, "Same difference." He walked to the door and paused. He said, "Mountains don't forgive men who cross lines." The man said, "Neither do daughters." The sheriff looked back once, ice cold. He said, "I'll be checking in." He stepped out. The door shut. The cabin exhaled. The younger girl leaned against the man and yawned like the danger had passed. The older girl said, "He'll come back." The man said, "I know." She said, "You scared?" He said, "Yes." She nodded. She said, "Good. Fear keeps people honest." He looked at both of them, standing in his house like they had always been there. Outside, the trees held still. The mountain listened. The fire caught quick, snapping loud like it was angry to be awake. The man shut the door after the sheriff and stood there longer than needed. The younger girl dragged a chair close to the hearth without asking. The older one stayed standing, arms crossed, watching the windows. The man said, "Sit or don't." She sat. The fire threw light across their faces, uneven, honest. The younger girl said, "Fire tells the truth." The man said, "Fire lies." She smiled. She said, "Only to men." The older girl said, "He's not done." The man said, "Neither am I." She said, "You don't fight him with fists." He said, "I don't fight." She said, "You already are." He fed another log into the flames. Sparks jumped. He said this mountain was owned before papers. She said, "By who?" He said, "Families. Old ones. They decided who mattered." She said, "And who didn't?" He nodded. The younger girl leaned forward, eyes reflecting orange. She said, "They took ladies." The man went still. The older girl said, "What ladies?" The man said, "Girls who asked questions. Women who said no. Widows who wouldn't sell." He spoke flat, like listing tools. He said they were told to be quiet. When they weren't, they were moved. The older girl said, "Moved where?" The man said, "Down." The younger girl whispered, "Wells." The fire cracked sharp. The older girl said, "My mother wrote letters." The man said, "I know." She said, "You knew her." He said, "I guarded her house once." She said, "You didn't save her." He said, "No." The word sat heavy. The younger girl rocked slow and hummed again. The man said, "Stop that." She said she liked this part. The older girl said she remembers songs from before. The man said that shouldn't be possible. The older girl said neither should this place. The fire flared suddenly, logs splitting loud. Shadows jumped across the walls like running figures. The younger girl laughed once, then stopped. She said, "They're mad." The man said, "Who?" She said, "The ladies." The older girl swallowed. She said, "They want names." The man said, "They have them. In letters. In dirt." She said, "That's not enough." He stared into the fire. He said, "I stayed to guard graves. Not land." The older girl said, "You stayed because you were afraid." He said, "Yes." The younger girl crawled closer to the hearth. He reached for her. She said don't. She held her hand over the heat without flinching. He said you'll burn. She said fire won't take what's already gone. The older girl snapped get back. The younger girl moved, slow, obedient this time. The man's hands shook. He clenched them until it passed. Outside, an engine coughed. Faint. Distant. The older girl stood. She said that's not the sheriff. The man listened. Tires on gravel. Slow. Careful. He said lights. She moved to the window and peered out. She said 2. Maybe 3. The younger girl said they're coming to ask. The man said no. They're coming to remind. The fire settled, low and steady now. The man said if things go bad you run. The older girl said together. He said no. She said yes. The younger girl said Papa doesn't run. He looked at her, fear and resolve twisting together. He said sometimes staying costs more. She said so does leaving. Headlights crept up the ridge, pale through the trees. The cabin held its breath. The fire kept burning, stubborn, bright. Outside, doors slammed. Voices carried, familiar and old. The past climbed the mountain, slow and sure, and the man stood, knowing some things survive fire and some things demand it. The headlights stopped just short of the clearing, engines idling like they were listening. Doors opened slow. Boots hit gravel with confidence, not hurry. The man stepped out onto the porch before they could knock. The older girl was at his side. The younger one stayed inside, watching through the crack in the door. A voice called his name, familiar, almost friendly. The man said you shouldn't be here. Another voice laughed and said this is still ours. 3 men stood by the trucks. Not deputies. Not strangers. Men with land in their voices. One said you bought what wasn't for sale. The older girl said you sold what you didn't own. The men looked at her then, really looked, and one of them frowned. He said that one's got her eyes. The man said leave. The man who spoke first said or what? Silence answered. The older girl stepped forward. She said my mother wrote letters. She said she begged. She said she named names. One man spat and said that's a lie. Another shifted his weight. The third squinted at the man and said I know you. The man said you should. The third said you were there that night. The man said I watched. The third man's face drained. He said you didn't stop it. The man said no. The older girl said where did you put her? The men laughed, too loud. One said down where noise doesn't travel. The younger girl's voice carried from the doorway. She said wells don't stay quiet. Everyone froze. The man turned. She was standing barefoot on the porch now, calm, eyes fixed past them. She said you hear them when the ground gets cold. One man whispered Jesus. Another said get the kid back inside. The man said follow me. He walked past them toward the trees. The men hesitated, then followed, drawn by something older than sense. The older girl stayed close. The younger girl trailed last, humming low. They reached the old well, stones half sunk, cover warped and gray. The man stopped. He said you don't touch this. One man laughed and said you don't own this dirt. The man said I protect it. The man who recognized him swallowed and said it's true then. The man said yes. The older girl said open it. One man said no. Another said we can talk. The man said now. Hands moved. Wood scraped. The cover shifted, slow, reluctant. A smell rose, damp and old. The younger girl stepped closer and said Mama. The older girl shook, fists clenched. She said say her name. No one did. The man who laughed before started backing away. He said this was settled. The man said nothing buried is settled. Voices rose. Accusations spilled. Deals mentioned. Badges named. One man said the sheriff knew. The older girl said we know. The man who recognized him looked into the dark and whispered forgive us. The younger girl said they're tired of that word. The cover came free. Stones clattered down the shaft. The sound took too long to fade. Everyone listened. The younger girl said see. The man closed his eyes. The older girl stood tall and said you don't get to leave now. The men backed up anyway, fear cracking their voices. One said we can fix this. The man said you can't. The younger girl stepped forward and shouted Papa, loud enough to shake something loose inside him. He opened his eyes and put a hand on her shoulder, steady. The wind moved through the trees like breath. The well sat open, waiting. No one spoke. The past stood up out of the ground, and there was no putting it back. No one moved away from the well. The night thinned but did not leave. The older girl knelt and reached into her coat, pulling the letters free like they had weight. She said my mother wrote these knowing no one would listen. One of the men said that was a long time ago. She said time doesn't forgive. People do. And you didn't ask. The man stood back, silent, letting her voice take the space he never could. She opened the first letter and read it plain. Names came out, steady, careful. Men shifted. One cursed under his breath. Another said that's not proof. She read another. Dates. Places. Wells marked with words like deep and quiet. The younger girl sat on a rock near the opening and swung her feet. She said she cried there. One man snapped at her to stop. She looked at him and said you can't stop memory. The older girl read faster now. Her voice didn't shake. She said they took my mother because she wouldn't sell. She said they took others because they spoke. She said they used badges to make it clean. The men started talking over her, excuses piling up. The man raised a hand once. Silence came, surprised at itself. He still did not speak. He watched the girls do what women had always done here. Say it anyway. Headlights flared behind them. The sheriff's truck rolled in too late. He stepped out, face tight. He said, "What is this?" The older girl turned. She said, "This is what you buried." The sheriff said, "Put the letters down." She said, "No." The sheriff said, "You don't know what you're stirring." She said, "We do." The younger girl said, "You hear them now too." The sheriff stiffened. He said, "Get away from that hole." The man finally spoke. He said, "You don't command here." The sheriff looked at him like betrayal. He said, "You think you won?" The man said no. She did. He nodded at the older girl. She stepped closer to the sheriff. She said, "You knew." He said, "I kept order." She said, "You kept silence." She read one last letter, voice cracking just once. It ended with a promise. "We will not disappear." The words hung heavy. The men backed away, one by one. One said, "We were told it was done." The older girl said, "It never is." Dawn started to bleed into the sky, thin and pale. The younger girl yawned. She said, "They can sleep now." The sheriff looked at the well, at the letters, at the faces watching him. His shoulders sagged. He said, "This ends my way." The man said no. "It ends theirs." The sheriff stepped back, hands empty. He said, "I can't stop what's coming." The older girl said, "You don't have to." He got into his truck without another word. The other men followed, fear louder than engines. Gravel spat as they left. The clearing felt different, lighter, raw. The older girl folded the letters and pressed them to her chest. The man still said nothing. The sun broke free. Birds started up, cautious. The younger girl slid off the rock and hugged the man's leg. She said they heard us. He nodded. The older girl looked into the well one last time. She said we'll mark it. He said yes. She said we'll remember. He said always. They stood there together as the light grew. No one spoke now. It wasn't needed. The mountain held the truth without shaking. What women left behind was no longer buried. It breathed. It waited. And it would not be quiet again. Morning did not rush them. Light slid in slow, touching the trees like it was asking permission. The man stood near the well, hands in his pockets, watching the girls like he was counting breaths. The older girl wiped dirt from her palms and said, "We can't stay." He nodded. He said, "I know." The younger girl shook her head hard. She said, "We stay." He said, "It's not safe." She said it never was. He walked back toward the cabin, the girls following without being told. Inside, the fire was ash now, warm but quiet. He grabbed a pack from the wall and set it on the table. He said, "There are people who will come." She said, "We already met them." He said, "Worse ones." The older girl leaned against the table and said, "You're thinking like you're alone." He said, "I've always been alone." She said, "Not anymore, whether you want it or not." He started packing anyway. Food. Water. A folded map. The younger girl climbed onto a chair and pushed items back out. She said, "No leaving." He said, "This is for you." She said, "I don't want it." He said, "You don't get to choose everything." She said, "You told me rules." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then listen." He froze at that. The older girl crossed her arms. She said, "We'll go if you say why." He kept his eyes on the pack. He said, "Because mountains take what you love." She said, "You already love us." He said, "That's the problem." She said, "No. That's the point." The younger girl reached across the table and took his hand. He tried to pull away. She held on. She said, "You didn't run. You stayed. That's how you earn it." He closed his eyes. His voice came rough. He said, "I don't know how to be what you're calling me." The older girl said, "Nobody does at first." She said, "You show up. You listen. You don't disappear." The younger girl nodded like this was obvious. She said, "You keep promises." He swallowed. He said, "I'm afraid." The older girl said, "Good. Fear means you care." He said, "I'm afraid I'll fail." She said, "You will. Then you fix it." The pack sat forgotten. Outside, wind moved through the trees like quiet approval. The man looked at the younger girl. He said, "You can't just give names." She said, "I didn't give it. I saw it." He said, "Names are heavy." She said, "So are mountains." He almost laughed. It surprised him. The older girl said, "If we stay together." He said, "I won't hand you back." She said, "We won't let you." He nodded once. The younger girl leaned in close, voice soft now, careful. She said, "Papa." Not testing. Not loud. Just asking. He felt it settle, not like a chain, but like a way he could carry. He breathed out. He said yes. The word felt strange and right all at once. The older girl watched him closely. She said, "Say our names." He did. Each one clear. Each one deliberate. Like a vow spoken without witnesses. The younger girl smiled and slid off the chair, already moving toward the window like the decision was done. He picked up the pack and set it back on the wall. He said, "We'll mark the well. We'll fix the fence. We'll stay quiet for a while." The older girl nodded. She said, "And then?" He said, "And then we live." The younger girl yawned and curled up on the bench, thumb in her mouth, trusting the room to hold her. He watched her sleep. The mountains stood outside, listening. He did not look away. No one left the cabin when the sun rose higher. They moved slow, like the ground itself asked for it. The man took a shovel from the shed and walked back to the well. The older girl followed, carrying stones one by one. The younger girl dragged a stick behind her, drawing circles in the dirt like she was closing something. No one spoke at first. The well waited, open and patient. They set the cover back carefully. Not rushed. Not hidden. Stones were stacked clean around the rim. The older girl pressed one flat and said, "This stays marked." The man said yes. The younger girl placed a wildflower on top and said, "So they know where to rest." The man nodded. He did not trust his voice yet. Back at the cabin, the windows were opened for the first time in years. Dust lifted and drifted out. The older girl pulled the curtains back and tied them loose. Light filled the room and stayed. The man fed the fire again, gentle this time. The younger girl sat close, sleepy, safe. She said, "It's warm now." He said, "It is." By noon, a truck climbed the ridge alone. The sheriff walked up without his hat. He did not step inside. He stood at the edge of the clearing like the line mattered. He said, "I turned in my badge." The man said, "Good." The sheriff looked at the girls. He said, "I won't be back." The older girl said, "You shouldn't be." The sheriff nodded, shame heavy on his shoulders. He turned and left without asking forgiveness. Days passed without being counted. Word moved faster than trucks. Old families stopped coming up the road. Land went quiet. The man fixed the fence where it burned years ago. The older girl helped, learning each knot, each pull. The younger girl sat nearby and talked to the air. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she listened. The man did not tell her to stop anymore. They planted near the well. Not a marker. Not a sign. Just something living. The older girl said, "It will take time." The man said, "That's fine." The younger girl pressed dirt down with her small hands and said, "Grow strong." The wind moved through the trees like agreement. At night, the cabin changed. Chairs were closer. Plates mismatched. The letters stayed in the Bible, but the Bible moved to the table where it could be seen. The older girl read sometimes. The man listened. The younger girl fell asleep mid-sentence more than once. Each time, she said "Papa" before sleep took her. Each time, he answered without thinking. One night, the older girl asked, "Are you still scared?" He said yes. She said, "Good. That means you'll stay awake." He said, "I already do." She nodded, satisfied. The mountains stayed the same and did not. Wind came. Rain came. Silence came back, but it was different now. It did not press. It held. The man stood on the porch and watched the girls move inside his house like they belonged to the walls. Maybe they did. Maybe the house remembered women who refused to vanish. Maybe it was tired of being empty. The younger girl curled up beside him one evening, head on his arm. She whispered "Papa" like it was a prayer she trusted. He watched the dark settle over the trees and felt no need to answer the mountain anymore. It had taken enough. It had given something back. Inside, the fire burned steady. Outside, the well stayed closed and marked. The past stayed buried where it could finally rest. The future stayed uncertain, but it stayed. The mountain kept what it loved. It always had.